Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, Farmer's Guide to Compost. My name is Mai, and I am an intern at ISE, the Institute for Sustainability Engagement. This work is part of my practicum for my master's in food studies at Syracuse University. And today we are joined by our four panelists. Three panelists, because one of them had to drop out rather quickly, but Matt Hamm, John Culpepper, and Nicole Kubiczki, who are all experienced composters who are working with farmers. This webinar is going to be an hour and a half and will be split into three sections. First, our panelists will each introduce themselves and what they're doing in their work, and then we'll do a little Q&A section with some broad composting questions that we have to give information on, and then we will open it up to the audience to ask their own questions. If you have any questions that you'd like the panelists to answer, feel free to put them into the chat box, and we'll run through those during that final section that's open to the audience. The session is also being recorded, so if you don't catch everything or want to look back on it, the recording will be available to you guys sometime after this, as well as the panelists have graced us with giving us their presentations after this as well, so we can share that resource with everyone as well. And our first person to speak will be Matt Hamm, if he is ready to speak.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. I will pull up your presentation and put it in presentation mode, please. Yay. Okay. Everyone can see it?
Okay, everybody, hello. My name is Matt Hamm. I'm the Soils and Compost Manager at McEnroe Organic Farm. I've been in agriculture now for approximately 25 years. I have been doing composting now for nearly 20 years, and I've been doing it with McEnroe Organic Farm now for 20 years. So what I'm going to do is in this presentation, I'm going to give you some insight into what our process is and how our farm and hopefully your farms can benefit from things like composting. So this is McEnroe Organic Farm Introduction to Compost. Next slide, please. So the main question is, what is compost? It's a mixture that consists largely of decayed organic matter and is used for fertilizing and conditioning soil. A lot of times I like to talk to people about how, the first initial thing is people think compost is just a simple fertilizer. It's much more than that. And we'll cover how it conditions the soil and how that happens. Next slide, please. What is the importance of compost? It enriches the soil. It helps with moisture retention. This, in turn, can help lessen the effects of drought. Compost is very good at holding moisture, is very good at drawing moisture, and overall improves the composition of the soil. It lessens the need for chemical fertilizers, which often had negative environmental side effects. A lot of times those fertilizers have a lot of runoff issues, can contaminate water sources, things like that. Encourages the production of beneficial bacteria and fungi that break down organic material and create humus, a rich nutrient-filled material. Again, that goes back to creating that topsoil layer that's healthy for plants, will help your plants grow and retain moisture in those hot summers that we get sometimes. This is our site right here. We have a 6-acre compost pad with a windrow pile system. We use a compost fleece system. The fleece is made out of a synthetic material, which tends to tighten with surface tension during rain to help keep the moisture content of the compost piles at a stable state. It also helps create that environment, a breathable environment for the aerobic organisms to thrive. Basically is the perfect environment for that to happen. We personally are permitted to compost 15,000 cubic yards of food waste per year. That's one of our ways to combat a lot of different climate issues revolving around food waste. We also do manures, including our own cow manure from our livestock operation and horse manure from local horse farms. We also use a geomembrane leachate control system, which keeps leachate from going into the ground and any contamination to where it goes to a collection system to safely reuse it or control it. Next slide, please. Compost happens, but here's what you can do to help. You need to make sure you have the proper CNN ratio. Moisture is important. As many people may know who do any backyard composting or anything like that, the mass of material and ingredients are all important. And of course, temperature and time. So in reference to the carbon and nitrogen material, these are the things where we're talking about. Carbon materials being brown materials referred to, green materials being green. As you can see, these are the examples of the different materials. A lot of ones that we deal with: aged hay, oat hay, dry shredded leaves, sawdust, chipped wood, cardboard, eggs carton, shredded paper, paper towels, straws, toilet paper rolls, wood ash, and dried grasses. And of course, the green materials are your manures, your food waste, anything of those sources. The general rule of thumb we use in our composting is a really good compost generally has a CNN ratio of 25 to 40 to 1. If you don't want to do the math involved with each one of those materials, there are charts and things available to tell you what the carbon to nitrogen ratios of those materials are. But the general rule of thumb to accommodate this is 3 browns to 1 green. The brown items are items that are high in carbon or carbohydrate processed: leaves, branches, twigs, sawdust. Green are items that have content that consists of nitrogen and protein. Those are your grass clippings, flowers, eggshells, coffee grounds, manure, vegetables, etc. The moisture level should be around 40 to 60%, which is a wet to damp sponge. And, like any other aerobic organism, we have to make sure that these piles are aerated, which for us, we use a windrow turner to do that. And we've also I'll cover it a little bit later, we have also found that different particle sizes will also help keep that pile aerated, with having a nice mix of small material to make it easier for the microorganisms to break down, the large materials to create air pockets to help the pile breathe a little bit. My pile is mixed, now what? Temperature is an indicator of microbial activity. The temperature in a pile goes up as the microorganisms start doing their thing. Make sure your pile stays moist and not soaked. This is really important. Soaked piles a lot of times can become anaerobic because of the weight of the moisture a lot of times. And sometimes that moisture creates an environment where the organisms that you don't want to have can thrive. So it's important to kind of stay in that happy zone of that 40 to 60% moisture rate. The more mass of material with a proper CNN ratio makes the process faster. That's a lot of the reason why a large-scale compost facility like us can make large-scale amounts of compost in 12 weeks versus what sometimes takes a whole season or more to do it in your backyard. Particle size also plays a role in how fast things break down. Again, the smaller particle size are easier for the organism to break down, but having some larger ones in there to help create those air pockets is also beneficial as well, which we found through our years. One of the indicators of aerobic versus anaerobic activity is good aerobic compost will have a nice earthy smell to it. Compost that is starting to go anaerobic will start to get a very sour, nasty smell, and you don't want that. Oops. Mature compost comes with amazing benefits. In review, compost can help improve fast draining, low nutrient soil. Again, going back to the compost is extremely good at holding moisture. Moisture can be drawn up with compost through capillary reaction, which is water moving up through against gravity through the different pores. Help loosen compact clay. creating proper drainage and root growth. This is important in heavy manipulated farm fields where topsoil has become compact. A lot of farmers out there will probably see this when you have years and years of using the fields and plowing. The topsoil layer of your field will become kind of compromised, whether it's hard or you're losing that. The organic matter that's created by compost will help improve that and help create a nice organic material to grow your plants in, to allow microorganisms to thrive, allow moisture retention, and to make sure that those fields are in good working condition moving forward. And again, there's the saving the money from not having to purchase as many fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, which we just kind of covered, provides an environment that allows beneficial organisms and fungi to flourish. These organisms can protect the plants from disease and help make other nutrients in the soil readily available. By composting food and other organic waste, the release of methane gas is greatly reduced by avoiding landfills. That's the one huge beneficiary thing for the environment is by, and as we are talking about in this with everybody, is by reducing that carbon output and sequestering that carbon. You're preventing all that methane from going into the environment, and methane is a very, very environmentally impactful carbon. It eliminates the need for chemical fertilizer, which often has negative environmental consequences, and revitalizes depleted soil. Soils that are heavily used with crop rotation and everything, they need to be fed, and compost is a great way to feed them. Again, increasing the ability for a plant to uptake, creating that organic matter, that tilth in the soil is all the major benefit of having compost. Thank you. I believe you're muted.
You, Matt, and I'm now passing it over to John.
Thank you, Mike. Give me just a second to figure out where I am. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you, Mai, and thank you everyone else for taking the time out of your busy days to listen to these presentations. Compost for Good is 3 people, myself, my daughter Katie, and Jennifer Perry, and Rowan. She's our executive director, top left. That's my first grandchild and Katie's oldest child. We work with people from all over the state, all over the world, and we are supported by several not-for-profits in the Adirondacks, and they serve as our administrative and fiscal sponsors. So when we send soil samples or compost samples to a lab, we get back results about the physical characteristics of those samples and the chemical characteristics, both very important. What's often missing is the biological characteristics. And to the extent that we have any information about the biology in a sample, it tends to be through the lens of what we call a CO2 emission study. And that simply gives you a sense that there's something living in the soil, but it doesn't really tell you what's in the soil, and not terribly useful. Contemporary soils, especially in row cropping systems, are often depleted, at least the biology in those soils are often degraded or depleted by cultivation and by the use of inputs like high salt fertilizers and pesticides. To reestablish the biology that is so important in soils, we use biologically diverse compost. Biologically diverse compost contains all of the following organisms. This is a slide that I made myself. I'm now a certified soil food web school microscopist, and I analyze lots and lots of samples from area farms and area compost makers. And this is what I often see is sample that has lots of bacteria, but not much else. Bacteria are important, but we need other organisms as well. For example, we need fungi and the spores that create the fungal hyphae that do so much of the good in soils. We need protozoa. We need lots of different protozoa, lots of numbers and lots of different kinds of protozoa. We need beneficial nematodes. These nematodes can consume up to 10,000 bacteria in a 24-hour period. And it's always nice to see microarthropods. Biology creates structure, soil structure, by creating aggregation in the soil. That aggregation is a result of the bacteria and the fungi releasing glue-like substances that glue soil particles together. When that happens, and when it happens well, then you create lots of what we call macro aggregates. And that's what you want to see, lots of macro aggregation that creates a lot of pore space. And that pore space is what increases our rooting depth. It increases things like soil water percolation rates. It increases things like cation exchange capacity. It increases water holding capacity, on and on and on. The bacteria and the fungi are the primary decomposers. Bacteria and fungi will literally solubilize plant nutrients from clays, silts, sands, and organic material. Those plant nutrients then stay within the bacteria and the fungi until they're consumed by what we call higher trophic level organisms. So a higher trophic level organism would be like protozoa, be like nematodes, microarthropods, and things like that. When that happens, then you get what we call natural nutrient cycling. There's enough nutrients in most soils to last for a long, long time. The problem is those nutrients are locked up, they're tied up by a variety of different chemical processes. The biology, good biology back in soil will make those nutrients available to plant root hairs again. There's a lot of ways to put compost, or the biology that's in compost, back onto land. Spreading compost, this is a site that's familiar to most of you, I suspect. You can spread compost in with a manure spreader, but you can also extract the biology from biologically diverse compost and suspend that biology in water. You can do that on a very small scale. I've got a 5-gallon extractor at my place and a 30-gallon extractor, but you can also do it on a very, very large scale, thousands and thousands of gallons at a time. This process is used to make what we call compost extract and compost tea. Extract is simply the biology that's forced out of the compost and suspended in water. Compost and compost extract is typically applied directly to the land. Compost tea is a more difficult process, takes longer to do. It replicates or reproduces. It allows conditions so that the microbes in that compost extract can duplicate and create many, many more of themselves. It's a much stickier material, and it tends to be used as foliar sprays. The nice thing is that we can apply both teas and extracts with existing equipment. The the thing to note with existing equipment, though, is that we have to be, because we're not applying fertilizer, we're applying biology. So we have to be mindful of the pressures involved. We also have to be mindful of 90-degree turns in the piping systems of these spray systems. But with minor modifications, easy enough to apply extracts on a large scale and on a very small scale. Additionally, with compost extract, you can apply that, you can dribble that at the time of planting with row crop systems. In this rig here, typically you put fertilizer in those polyethylene drums, but instead we would put a compost extract in there and apply that compost extract right to the seeds, right within the furrow. Now, part two, Jennifer Perry was going to give this presentation, and I'm going to do the best that I can with Jennifer's slides. So who do we support? We support a whole wide variety of folks, farmers in particular, but we also work with a lot of other organizations. Why work with farms? Well, lots of reasons. We help farms create on-site fertility. We help them with manure management. We just love working with farmers. We help farmers find grants. We help them apply for grants. We also help them form partnerships. And here are some of the partners who we have worked with in the last several months: Cornell Cooperative Extension, Compost Association of Vermont, the Lake Champlain Basin Program, Clarkson University, you name it. We also do lots and lots of site visits for farms. We go there and we try to understand what their goals are and try to help them accomplish those goals. We help farms build individualized compost plans. We help them think about what they're doing and how to do it better. Every farm that we have visited, we've been able to help the farmers involved create conditions that generate better, higher value compost. Three farms that Jennifer wanted to highlight, and I'll get to that in just a second, but she also wanted to highlight two recent grants that she got, one involving biochar and one involving animal mortality composting. And I'll just throw in a little piece here. I have a particular interest in helping people understand that there's a wide variety of feedstocks out there, nitrogenous-based feedstocks out there. So I'm heavily involved in the natural organic reduction thing that's happening around the country. New York State is now the 12th state to legalize the composting of human remains. And also we have the first DEC registered facility to process diverted human urine. I'm not going to say any more about that, but I could talk for days about human urine. One farm that we work with extensively is the Ben Weaver Farm. That's right on Lake Champlain in Willsboro. And we have done a lot of work with the folks there. And here's some of the work that we have done with them. When we first visited the Ben Weaver Farm, this is what their compost looked like from their cattle operation. So there's a big high tunnel where cows spend the winter, and then that was just piled up outside. We helped them bring that compost back inside, or leave the manure inside and create a higher value compost. They're actually doing really quite well with this. They also, through a competitive grant, won one of our composters. This is a 4-foot by 20-foot rotating drum composter that I designed about 10 years ago, and they use that to compost horse manure bedding, horse bedding. Another farm we work with is Reber Rock in Essex, New York. We've done a fair bit of work with Reber Rock, and we've helped them understand how to, and they do their own butchering, and we've worked with them to help them understand how to compost the offal, the leftover parts, excuse me, from the butchering of their animals. And right there in the center is Jean Bonnetal, a world-renowned mortalities expert, works with folks from all over the world. We gave a workshop there not too long ago. Another farm we work with is the Witten family farm. And I'll just pull out one particularly interesting thing that we've done with the Witten farm, but we've helped in a lot of different ways. I'll leave that slide up there for just a second longer. We helped them apply for a grant that allowed them to build a fairly large scale aerated static pile composting system with reverse airflow. And so as most of you may know, in aerated static piles, the air is generally forced up through the pile of material that you're composting. In this case, that air is drawn down and into the barn that the bays are attached to. And that heated air and that high moisture air and that air that contains nitrogen compounds is then pumped into this bed. It's a big growing bed in there in this greenhouse. We've also helped them design publications, and we've done lots of, or at least several workshops at their farm. So we've got a lot of resources available, and I know I'm going through this quickly, but these slides will be available to you so that you can learn more about the resources if you're interested. And also, you'll have access to our contact information. And with that, hopefully I didn't take more than my allotted time. Maya, how did I do?
You did beautifully. Thank you, John.
Awesome. Thank you.
And now we will have our last presentation from Nicole. And I am back to sharing my screen. There we go. Whenever you're ready, Nicole.
Awesome. Thanks, Mai, and thanks, John and Matt, for kind of kicking us off in such a nice way. My name is Nicole Kubiczki, and I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, an agency called the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So we're the conservation arm of USDA. I serve as the state urban conservationist for New York. However, I am a former soil scientist for the agency, and so truly soil and compost holds a very dear place in my heart. Next slide, please. I wanted to give an introduction to who NRCS is, because I see a couple folks familiar names on here, but perhaps not everyone is familiar with the agency. So again, conservation driven, we take a collaborative and resource driven approach. And so when I say resources, we're evaluating things like those top 5, starting with the soil, water, air, plants, and animals. We additionally have a couple considerations: energy and the human element, which you can't really extract from the resources, right? If we're managing the landscape, whether it's farming or through forestry or other land uses, there's certainly a human element there. It is locally led solutions. We partner very closely with our soil and water conservation districts as well as extension, but really the heart and soul of the work that we do, it is led by that, what we would call a producer, farmer, grower. So that's also kind of what we're getting at with the locally led solutions part. I often say that when I'm on a farm, I'm learning more sometimes from them than they are from me. Next slide, please. Services provided, it really starts with conservation planning. So we do resource concern evaluations, and for the context of this discussion, it's really these soil health assessments. We can provide them recommendations. We love our maps. We make lots of different maps and can provide designs. And those designs can be agronomic in nature or also engineering for potential interventions and practices that we can do on a landscape. And then once we have done that conservation planning, that can feed into our financial assistance programs. I'm not going to get into all the different minutiae of what money is available. There's a lot of acronyms. We only have a certain period of time here. But when I say financial assistance programs, you can kind of read that as a grant, but that's the language we use. Next slide. So we're really here to talk about soil practice called soil carbon amendment. It used to be an interim, kind of like a beta. We're testing it out and feeling it out. It was an interim practice up until recently. It was practice code 808. It has recently gone live as soil carbon amendment practice code 336. And that can be used for both compost and biochar, or a blend of the two, which a lot of people really love if, they can use compost products to charge their biochar, and oftentimes that's a recommended and best management practice. But we're gonna focus on compost today. Next slide. This is that in-field soil health assessment that I mentioned. It was issued through the agency as a technical note, and it's linked at the end of my slides. We don't always come up with user-friendly tools here at the agency, but I love this document. I've been asked a few times for colleagues to give farmer trainings on how to use this. If you're able to dig a 8 to 12 inch hole with a track spade in your field, you can run through this assessment. So we're getting at a lot of the things that John actually covered. One of the resource concerns that we look at is soil organic matter depletion. And we're using that as an in-field assessment. We're not necessarily sending in tests, right, and charting that over time. But also John brought up aggregates. So one of these other decision trees here that you see is for aggregate instability. We're also looking at compaction as a potential issue, and then soil organism habitat loss and degradation. And really we do this assessment with the farm, and then from there we then potentially pull in a suite of practices that we can use to address those issues, make for this instance, soil organic matter depletion better. Perhaps it's through mulching and reduced till or no-till, cover cropping. But compost through soil carbon amendment is also one of those potential practices. Next slide. Now, when you get closer working with your local NRCS planner, you're developing the plan, you do need to know that there are some pretty stringent parameters in order to get financial funding for compost. One of those things is there is a testing requirement. I linked the standards at the back of my slides as well, so you'll be able to access that. But there's two tables that we have to test for. This first table, you'll see the parameters there. There's either a reporting requirement or it needs to be below a certain threshold. There's table 2 on the next slide. And that one is also, we require that testing to be done. And here you have some of the biologicals. This is where the testing can get a little expensive. So a farmer, before signing a contract, really needs to understand what that payment rate is going to be and what those requirements are. When you're testing biologicals, there's only a couple labs that I'm aware of that are doing it at scale. Last I checked. Now that granted, that was probably a year ago in the country, and you're sending a decent amount of material. It could be a quart, could be a gallon, and you're overnighting it. So even the shipping alone gets a bit expensive. Next slide, please. When we come up with the recommendations, given your situation on your farm and your fields, equipment needs to be calibrated, right? There's a lot of different ways we can do it. I, as a urban conservationist, sometimes work with folks with raised beds or at very small scale. And so perhaps they're calibrating with 5-gallon buckets or wheelbarrows, right? As long as you can do the calculations to calibrate. In this case, this was an example from a farm I worked with to apply compost at their farm. And they used this BBI spreader. They tracked how many miles per gallon they were going, how wide they were opening the apron gate, and were able to come up with how many tons of compost per acre they were applying. This is critical both for the nutrition of the crops and crop uptake based off of soil tests, but also important given things that we assess, which include the nitrogen leaching index, as well as we use something that's called the New York Phosphorus Index. And so your planner will run those assessment tools in the background to make sure that through this application of compost, we're not causing an issue on the landscape for water bodies and other things concerning nutrient loading of phosphorus and nitrogen. Next slide. I wasn't going to get into it much, but certainly with the Q&A, we can actually sat on a training with our engineer team on this today on composting facilities. We have a few different options. It often involves a suite of practices, pouring a concrete pad, potentially roofing. One of the examples John gave, you roofed it. It's like, sometimes you don't want that excess water to get into the system. So you can have a 3-bay system, or the next slide shows some in-vessel composters. This was new. This came out of the agency's desire to make sure we're meeting the needs of small acreage growers. I am not endorsing any sort of particular manufacturer, but we just wanted to give an example of this Earth Cube and Eco Drum that would potentially meet the New York's NRCS standard. There is a 15-year lifespan. You could imagine this retail drum with the X on it probably won't have a 15-year lifespan and wouldn't meet that requirement. But there can be examples of windrows. John brought up animal mortality. We have the ability to also fund and evaluate animal mortality facilities. Next page. So how to apply and how to start this process. It all starts with that site visit, that relationship between that farmer, grower, compost producer, what have you. Set the goals and objectives, where you are now and where do you want to go, and what NRCS practices can fit in there. That's the creation of the conservation plan. You can then sign an application. That's the CPA 1200. It is competitive dollars. That's ranked, and it's a competitive selection. So if you're pre-approved, you can then choose to proceed with this federal contract. Next slide. Here's these general resources. We have the Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities. I love that. Out of Cornell. So there's some really good information there. John mentioned one of the women that help run that. We have the link for the cropland infield assessment. And then I linked 2 different conservation practice standards, one for soil carbon amendment and one for composting facility. Next slide. This is the USDA non-discriminatory statement. You can advance to the last slide. And going to turn it over to Mai to see where we're going to go with opening questions. But if you do want to take your phone out or later, I suppose, since you'll be getting the slides, that QR code, you can scan that and find where your local service center is. We nearly have in New York a USDA service center in every county. Adirondacks, not so much. It gets a little tricky when you get downstate. But you can find your service center and start that relationship with NRCS to see if there's some good options for you. Thank you.
Sweet. Thank you, Nicole. We are right on track with time, and now we're going to go into our next section where we have just some overlaying questions that we can start off on, have people think of maybe smaller, more detailed questions that they might want to ask in our audience opened section. So I thought I'd do it kind of in themes. So when you are trying to start out with compost, it takes a little bit of time to start your first batch and have that process. So I want to ask the panelists, where can farmers produce high quality compost if they're not producing it on site? And then are all composts the same? How can farmers determine the quality of compost they are buying?
I'd love to take a stab at that.
Gorgeous.
Not all compost is made the same, I can assure you. I showed you a picture of bacteria. A lot of the farms and a lot of the compost producers that I analyze their material, I'm seeing mostly bacteria. And bacteria are important, but oftentimes the bacteria, there's just not enough diversity of bacteria, and that's just about all there is in there. So you want to see all of those, what we call functional groups, in the compost, the fungi, the protozoa, the nematodes, and microarthropods. The only way, really, I mean, there's several ways to test. You can do, and I have done this, genetic testing, whereby you do very expensive testing, and you can break the organisms down by genus and sometimes all the way down to species. But really, the best way to do this is to have your sample of compost looked at by someone who knows what they're doing under a microscope. 400x is all you really need. There are more and more trained microscopists coming online all the time. You can go to the Soil Food Web School, and there is a map that you can access that shows all of the microscopists around the world, and which is very helpful. There are probably other microscopists out there, but I'm just not aware of them. You'll see more and more as time goes on, though. But that's really my recommendation, is to have somebody who knows what they're doing take a look at it under a microscope. That's the best way. Or I can help you buy your own microscope, and I've trained a lot of people virtually on what to look for. We can do this in real time.
Very cool. Maybe I'll join in on that sometime. I was wondering, maybe a little precise, if you're going to a compost facility to buy from their bulk, is there a certain list of nutrients that you can ask them for, that they are constantly measuring for? Is there certain nutrients that are better to think about depending on what your needs are?
Well, I'll also take a stab at this, and then Matt and Nicole may want to weigh in. I'm a classically trained plant scientist, and through all my college work, it was always about nutrients, and I've had to rethink all of this, and no longer for me is it about nutrients; it's about biology. The right biology will liberate what the plant needs. Plant needs, not to get too anthropomorphic about it, but plant change their needs on an hourly, probably a minute by minute, perhaps a second by second basis. And so if we think we're smarter than the millions of years of interaction between microorganisms and plants, I can assure you we are not. They figured this out a long time ago. And so I'll stop there.
To kind of tag along with what John said, he actually brings up a huge point about the microbiology of compost, because, the fact remains is largely compost is a slow releasing item. So, that microorganisms interacting with both the soil and the compost are all really what makes that nutrient availability really happen. And without that, you can have scenarios, and kind of going back to compost quality, you have scenarios where you may see some uncomposted wood material, which can lock up nutrients. There's a lot of things that can lock up nutrients, and without the biology there, you're already starting off at a disadvantage irregardless. And, you know, again, there's nutrients that are in the soil that you're trying to boost as well. So the biology is super important to make sure that all of those things kind of have that symbiotic meshing going on, you know, beneath the surface. And also with, you know, there's a lot of people don't consider that there is a respiration between soil and air. So all that is all, you know, held together by the microorganisms that we're talking about today.
Jump in and add a few things. You know, so when going to have that purchasing discussion, I guess I can speak to this both as an NRCS person and somebody that's worked on farms and sometimes orders compost 5 to 10 yards at a time. That's kind of what we're growing at in terms of our little backyard situation. So in both of those contexts, ask for test results, but make sure that you're explicit, like that this is from the windrow in which I am purchasing. Because I have seen as a soil scientist where I go, I get the results, I look at it, that looks good, looks like finished compost, supposed to be manure based only, and then it shows up on the property with a dump truck, and there's a lot of those wood chips that Matt's speaking to that it doesn't have the correct C to N ratio. Those wood chips are still there 2 growing seasons later. That's highly problematic. Also, we see where, depending on the system, you know, wind can blow things around and you get a lot of plastics and things that really shouldn't be, you know, in your soil. So just being mindful of that and smell it. I know that sounds weird, but also as a soil scientist, that jasmine and all of those glues and aggregates, man, there is nothing like it. And you smell that compost and you know it's good from the get. And also be mindful that it's finished. If you're growing leafy greens from a food safety standpoint, and you're going to be growing in that medium, I've also seen product where simultaneously you have wood chips, simultaneously there's unprocessed cow manure in it, and that's not a finished product, and you could run into some food safety things. And the last thing I'll add is, you know, we kind of take a many approaches. Nothing's a panacea in the landscape approach here at NRCS. And while we definitely support pulling in carbon into a system, we also have the tenets of soil health, you know, keeping a living root year round, decreasing disturbance and decreasing tillage, you know, those microbes that John's talking about. You can't have good fungal relationships if you're going in and tilling all the time. Keep that ground covered, whether it's with mulch or that living biomass, and then increasing diversity, which compost can be a form of that diversity because we've kind of expanded that to include animal diversity. So if it's an animal-based product, you're pulling in some manure sources. So that can happen both through pasture systems and having livestock on a landscape, or pulling in animal products in the form of manure.
So much information. Thank you. I guess I'll move on to my next little theme of starting compost on your land. We've kind of briefly mentioned along everyone's presentations and our last responses, but what are some of the compost processes? So we have forced aeration and then turned windrows and then in-vessel turning systems. What are kind of like the pros and cons of using either or system, or depending on what your farm needs? What are kind of comparative things you can think about?
I think some of it is like everything else in any of these processes is cost. You know, we use a windrow turner with a fleece system. Those things come at a pretty high cost. You know, our windrow turner is a Bacchus windrow turner. It'll do a windrow that's roughly 8.5 feet tall by 22 feet wide. You know, those machines can be up to $500,000 just for the machine without even adding the reel system or any other external equipment used for the type of composting you're doing. You know, any sort of engineering things you may need to consider, like with food waste composting, you know, there's leachate, so you have to have a engineered process to handle that. So I think that's a lot of it. I mean, they all have their pluses and minuses there, but the concept of, what they're trying to accomplish is very similar. Aeration and increase of microbiology, decrease of dangerous pathogens. Yeah.
And I'll sum it up really simply, at least for me. Any process that optimizes the environmental conditions for the microbes is what you want to shoot for. That tends to mean containerized systems, or at least covered systems, and they can be pretty simple or they can be highly engineered and expensive.
Anything to add, Nicole?
I don't. They covered it.
Perfect. So then, continuing off of the different processes that we can have, what equipment or supplies are needed? So, like, maybe what are your basic things that would work in each system? And then beyond that, what type of equipment would you need for spreading it or incorporating it on farms, especially thinking about low or no-till sort of farms?
Well, and we covered in our presentations there, one of the more common ways of using it is spreading it in a spreader. The good thing about compost is it's very easy on a spreader. It's usually, free of any objects that are going to damage your spreader. Kind of like what John covered, we've done it before in our farm too, using compost tea and different types of compost extractors. I mean, you can generally run those through, to his point, which was a really good point. You can run those through your typical spraying equipment with some considerations. There can be some small material that is left over. Some people use different types of filters to kind of strain the material before they put it in sprayers. But there's ways to use it using most current equipment that you'll find around most farmers' farms.
Well, I'll add that, if you've got the nitrogenous material, whether it's manures or whatever it is, you still need the browns. And the browns can sometimes, depending upon location, be hard to come by.
Mm-hmm.
And browns could be wood chips, they could be leaves, they can be, in my research, I've done a lot of work with densified wood pellets, which turn into sawdust as soon as they're wet. But the nice thing about densified wood pellets is you can auger them through a auger system, so you can ramp up the size. Speaking of size, we also have developed what we call a neighborhood scale composting system. It's a batch system, very simple. It couldn't be any simpler, in fact. And we have umpteen different ones in New York and Vermont and elsewhere. Very, very simple. Go to our website, and there is, just like with the larger 20-foot composter that I designed, this is an open source system. You can take it and modify it. You can do whatever you want with it, but it's a very simple system, but you can create about a cubic yard at a time with these systems. And if you have, for example, Camp Dudley, a camp on Lake Champlain last summer with, I think, 8 of these. They're nothing more than 4-foot diameter by 4-foot tall polyethylene highway culverts. That's all they are, with an augering system. And they processed about 25,000 pounds of food scraps at their camp. Now, that doesn't include the carbon that they used. So very simple systems are out there, and but the more expensive the system, they tend to optimize the environmental conditions for the microbes that do the vast majority of the work.
And I love that, John, the kind of thinking about the carbon material, right? Is there an adequate space that's appropriately dry, moisture conditions to stage that carbon material? So depending on how much manure when you're mucking out the barns, when you're harvesting and turning over a high tunnel and you have that influx of nitrogen, high nitrogen material, do you have enough to balance it? And some of the other things I think about, again, somebody that I've worked on big dairies, but right now I'm focusing on kind of smaller scale agriculture. Thinking about rodent protection is super important too, from a food safety standpoint. So whether you have some chicken wire or hardware cloth to make sure that the system is adequately closed off. It can even be cats, but from those unwanted critters. And making sure that there's some sort of pad, again, both from the nutrient standpoint, when I mean a pad, either a gravel substrate or a concrete base. If you're using a skid steer and stuff, you may probably want something, or a tractor, or a concrete base, but gravel could be adequate if you're at the scale of a wheelbarrow. Those areas are heavy use. You're traipsing over them all the time. They can get mucked up really easy, sloshy mess. And so you want to have a nice, hard, firm base that you can walk off of, that you can work off of. And the last thing I sometimes see that's not already around on these farms is having some sort of tumbler system. So you have the finished product. There might be things here and there that are not the size of the finished material you want, especially if you're just top dressing at a smaller scale and you want to have that nice seed bed in order to sow your carrots or what have you. So have some sort of tumbler to get rid of the bigger material and sieve the compost material appropriately.
Thank you for that. We're getting close to when I wanted our audience Q&A to start, so I'll just finish off with one more question, and then if people have questions in the chat, if you'd like to put them there, and we'll read through those. But talking about making compost, it comes to a point where maybe you're producing more than you can use on your land in a season, or maybe you're looking to make a revenue out of it. What would you say is, how can you turn it into that revenue? And then what opportunities can you take to take in some more of that material? As Matt noted in his presentation in the beginning, food waste is a huge issue, and you got whole residential areas that are having food waste, and that's a possible place to get more material. So what would you say are some steps into bringing up your stock and making a profit from it, perhaps?
I'd love to take a stab at that, Mai. I've got a colleague in California at Catalyst Bioamendments. They're selling a cubic foot of compost, cubic foot, 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot, for $200. They're selling it, they can't make enough of it, and they're selling it to farmers, not in the 1 cubic foot size, but in the truckload size. And the reason, and you probably know that farmers don't spend money on things that are unproven. I've got another colleague in the Albany area that's selling a cubic foot of compost for $20. $20 versus $200. What on earth makes one worth $20 and one worth $200? Well, the market is one. So we're not in a market yet where people are screaming for, the highest quality compost. In California, they are. So we have a lot of education to do. But this is another way to add value to compost is, especially compost makers, is to get into different markets, whether it's soil erosion, erosion socks, or other seed mixes, mixes for greenhouses. You can add value to good compost and sell it for more to increase your revenue on the farm.
And also, compost in a lot of ways is a classic, game of one man's trash is another man's treasure as well. And, on the front end of it, when the material is coming in, like a compost facility like us, there's tipping fees involved where companies will pay you to drop the material off, which helps offset your operation, which helps, pay for new equipment. It can help on the other end of things with pricing and things like that. But exactly like John said, you create a high quality material that's proven, that has good results. People will pay for that because in the long run, it's worth it. Healthy soil, it improves, crop production, it improves germination, it improves everything. So, it can be an input. It can be a money situation on both ends of it, right in the very beginning with tipping fees and receiving waste that you're processing for people, and producing a high quality product on the other end also is a big opportunity. So it can really go both ways. And then there's also using it as one of your inputs for various different soil blends and things like we do. So it really, there's a lot of opportunity for that, depending on the investment level and depending on what you either have in place or, things that you're are able to put in place.
And then I just popped something on the chat, Mike, because you talked about like the food waste, and Matt, you were kind of talking about like waste streams, and we do that at our little homestead. We get if there's a road crew, we're in a little bit more rural area, so I'm not as concerned about like salts and for things like leaf mulch and stuff like that. So if I see a crew from our town that's picking up leaf products, I'm like, okay, well, can you? I like pull over and put my 4-ways on, right? And same with if there's somebody that's doing tree work for the lines, and usually that's a liability for them in terms of they need to go all the way back to their facility to drop off their wood chips. I usually ask what type of trees it was. I don't want a bunch of black walnut wood chips, but depending on what material that is, I get that dropped off on the land too. And so I did put in the chat though, the USDA, our Office of Urban Agriculture Innovative Production, does have some food waste, or at least historically. The funding cycle isn't open right now, but food waste reduction cooperative agreements, and that's more large scale, I think, municipality level, tribal government level. But there's some opportunities there to kind of take the food waste piece and turn it into composting, viable composting stuff.
Great. And I think
Also, a little side note, real quick. When you get involved with municipalities as well, I mean, a part of composting, and one thing that we've learned over the years of doing composting is there's the factor of being a good neighbor while you're doing it, and being involved with your community as part of that. It also has opportunities that go beyond the monetary value of it. So it's really important, that getting involved in municipalities, having a place for your community to compost is all really beneficial as well.
Sweet. Thank you for that extra note. I was going to touch a little bit on if anyone wanted to talk about contamination issues of bringing in feedstock. I think Nicole kind of covered that a little bit, of asking questions and then also thinking about what we've talked about with the market, and if people are educated enough or have that education of what compost is and what goes into compost, then we can sort of avoid that. But do you guys have methods of outreach to communities to make sure contamination doesn't happen, or some sort of middleman hauler that can help with that process?
I would say it's really important to know the source of your feedstocks. For example, there are some persistent herbicides that are used less and less now, but they can really do a lot of damage to crops. If you compost with hay, for example, that comes from fields that are sprayed with persistent herbicides. Another thing to look out for is Nicole mentioned leaves. Leaves are fantastic. I tend to encourage people to just pile up leaves and let Mother Nature do the work of turning that material into leaf mold. You don't really have to do much with that. Leaves aren't the best carbon source for composting because they mat, and also leaves have more nitrogen in them oftentimes than you might think. The other last bit is be aware of the jumping worms that are moving into our area.
Mhm.
A good hot compost facility will kill off all those worms, but if you don't have really high temperatures, you want to be careful. And then manures, you really want to be mindful that you've got a process that fully decomposes the manures for reasons that may be obvious.
Yeah, and to John's point, when we obviously deal with various different sources at our compost facility, and any new source that's going to be introduced to the facility never comes to the facility first. It's always tested to find out just exactly what he's talking about, whether it's persistent herbicides, pesticides, for any forever chemicals, things like that. Because not only can you can not only possibly ruin a whole batch of compost, which, a lot of work goes into, but you could potentially contaminate your whole facility, which then, creates its own set of problems. So it's really important, exactly like you said, to know where the material is coming from and develop a relationship with the people that the material comes from. Obviously with food waste, one of the concerns is plastic. So, which you handle with a variety of things. You handle with education. You develop that relationship with the different haulers and things like that, and let them know like what you have to, like any other good relationship, you have to set boundaries, and you have to make sure that and it's public outreach. It's all the things we're doing, like these webinars where people learn about these things, the contaminants, the things that, and their negative impact. One of the kind of ongoing things we talk about at our facility is like our arch nemesis is the fruit sticker, because it's just big enough to be a pain in the butt. It's just small enough where it could get through your screens. And, so you put vacuums on your screen system to get them out. And then when you can show the general public a mesh sock full of millions of fruit stickers that had to be pulled out of that material, it's like, it's all those different things, being able to have the evidence, doing these studies that show where this is, like making all these improvements from the consumer level right down to the compost level is all what's going to improve that going forward with everybody. It's all about education, having these conversations and consistently doing these things so people understand where the problems come from.
And to your point, Matt, PLUs, the stickers on fruit and vegetables, are a pain in the neck.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are people working really hard right now to make sure that they are biodegradable. European Union no longer allows non-compostable PLUs, and because we send a lot of product over to Europe, we're working really hard at standardizing fruit stickers, vegetable stickers, so that they meet standards and that they are fully compostable.
All right, cool. Thank you guys for all of that. I'm running a little bit behind on the time I mentally planned for this, but we are now going into the chat to find some questions to answer in the last 20-ish minutes that we have. If we don't get an opportunity to reach all the questions, by all means, we'll have the contact information for all of our panelists if you want to direct them directly for them after this. They can do that. So I'll just go to the very first question that we got in the chat, which is from Nancy. And she said, is it better to spread compost on pastures rather than manure?
Always.
Yeah.
See, I don't know if NRCS would answer that way. I think that's why we're all jumping at the gun to answer that. Go ahead, John.
No. I think I took the word right out of your mouth.
Well, it's just that I think it's about a management thing. If they're pastures and you're rotationally grazing those animals, and it's proper stocking density and stuff like that, that manure is great on there, right? And it's a labor thing. Like if you are a livestock operator and you're unable and don't have the system to compost, then please get that organic matter on the landscape in a way. Now that the nutrients interact differently in terms of thinking about nitrogen and phosphorus, we need to be a little bit more sensitive if it's manure and not a finished compost in terms of more recalcitrant organic matter and slow releasing nitrogen. So we need to be mindful of that. But really, that is a personal question based off of labor in your farm and your management.
Yeah, and definitely. I think to kind of follow up with that as well is I do think that compost is like to your point is definitely a little bit more nutrient balanced and a little bit less likely for any sort of pathogen considerations as well. So it also depends on like your applications. You mentioned food safety before, which is one of those things that's and that's actually one thing that I think gets overlooked a lot with a lot of composting stuff is the understanding that food safety laws have become a lot more strict, and that does trickle down to the compost and soils you use and how they're applied and how they interact with the plant, how much of the plant touches the soil, things like that. So those are all really important things to consider as well when you're applying anything to your land as well. So
Awesome enthusiasm. Thank you, guys. We'll move on to the next question in the chat from Betsy. For the air drawn down, does it contain methane? So I'm guessing this is in the composting process.
Yeah, and I think I brought that up with the Witten farm. So good, well-engineered systems should produce very, very little methane, if any at all. It's hard to be completely methane-free in a compost operation, but for the system that I highlighted on the Witten farm, they do have monitors. They're not seeing methane, and since they're pumping it into an enclosed, well, it's a sort of a leaky barn type setting, but they still want to be mindful that they don't want to build up methane in there. So in a well-engineered system that's aerobic, where the air is pumped in at the right schedule, you should get very little methane produced. Methane is produced when things go anaerobic. They're produced by anaerobes, which are microbes that thrive in an oxygen poor environment, and we don't want those. We don't want those sort of microbes ramifying within compost systems. So we try to keep the conditions such that we don't see those microbes. Therefore, we don't generate the methane.
I looked through the chat and I'm summarizing a little bit because I think Laura, Betsy, again, and Sienna have some similar type of questions looking at kind of our recipe that we are creating, the feedstock we're putting in about how do we systematically get the recipe that we want, especially thinking about bringing a source of feedstock from outside of the conditions that we can control on our farm. Does anyone want to try to answer that? I feel like it's really hard.
So I saw one of the questions that talked about how difficult it might be to compost. And the way I think about it and the way I talk about it is that stuff just wants to decompose. So on the one hand, compost could not be easier. Given the right amount of time, the right conditions, things will break down. Maybe not in a thermophilic way, a hot compost, but nonetheless, that compost, cool composting, given enough time, and if you're careful, you can produce really good compost that way. On the other hand, composting is unbelievably complicated because of the interactions, physical, chemical, and biological interactions. It is amazing how complicated it can be. But you don't need to think about that. You don't need to worry about that. Just come close to the right C/N ratio, the right moisture content, and things are going to break down.
I was also reading into the questions a little bit as well, and one of the questions was compost being balanced and it being highly alkaline. That does tend to happen in compost. It can have a pH between 6 and 8 a lot of times. You know, one of the things I'm guessing it might be towards maybe growing something using it and, you know, and being aware of the pH material, because, you know, for a lot of reasons, for a release of nutrients under certain pH levels. With our farm, some of the soil blends we make do that. They adjust the pH, whether it's a soil blend that uses peat moss, which is acidic, which will bring that pH closer to, you know, neutral or acidic, depending on how much you add. There's different types of minerals to add. So compost can be used in tandem with other things to make blends that can accommodate pretty much most things. And, you know, that's why it's such a good base, again, introducing that biology and the ability to utilize those nutrients at a high level. As far as sodium and chloride concerns, that's something that's kind of something that you're going to deal with dealing with organics, you know, especially with something like food waste. You know, a lot of stuff you get can be pre-consumer. You can get a mix of pre-consumer and post-consumer food. So those things are variables that you keep an eye on. And, you know, with our compost, we have monthly testing, so we can see how those levels fluctuate. You can kind of see how those feedstocks, that when you add them to your compost, how they may cause those levels to fluctuate. And that's really kind of where the control comes in, is knowing how adding each one of those feedstocks in will affect the outcome and will affect, you know, that final testing range is really what you have to pay attention to right there.
Yeah, and usually that'll be reported out as electrical conductivity, EC, right? You're not going to see it as in the framing of the question of the chlorine and the sodium. You know, it's going to read differently on a soil test, and it does cause issues if you're just growing in straight compost, and you're using municipal water that might be hard water, that is chlorinated, that does have your magnesiums, your calciums, your other salts, various forms of salts in it, and you're using both within the watering system and the compost, you can start to see pH creep up. I've worked with some farms that were growing mostly in compost using municipal water and inside a high tunnel, and between, so they're not getting the natural precipitation of the rain, right? It's all coming from the municipal water system. And in those cases, you do see EC levels that start to get way too high. You start to see your pH get way too high in terms of nutrient balances and imbalances. So it's really something to be mindful of. But by and large, if you're just using compost as an amendment to your growing soil medium, or if you're adding things like Matt said, like the peat moss, most farmers are liming their soils in order to increase pH, because in a temperate mesic environment like we are in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast, nitrogen is the most acidifying factor in a growing environment. And so you're gonna start to see pHs drop over time as you continue to add nitrogen to a system. And so really the compost is almost helping in that regard, because it's getting that pH to creep up a little bit. You'll probably have to lime still, but you might not have to lime quite as much, because the compost is kind of, depending on how much you're adding, you know, usually coming in at a higher pH.
All right, and then the last question that's in the chat, if we have another minute beyond that, I have some more I can pull out. But is there a market that keeps track of composting price? I think this goes to what John mentioned earlier about his buddy in California.
U.S. Composting Council does track pricing. There are probably others. Nicole, you probably are better able to address this.
I actually don't pay much. I mean, for my job, really haven't been charting it too much. We definitely have more of a robust list of biochar producers because it's something that was kind of newer. And when folks reach out to us for biochar, we've held some webinars as an agency with our soil health division. And those producers of biochar have kind of said where the market was, where it is, where it's going. But I can't actually answer that in terms of tracking of those markets besides what you've already said, John.
And a lot of it is availability in general, those kind of things, organic material, good soil, things like that are not super readily available. They would be, but for instance, our compost facility, we sell product, including compost, that travels over the road quite a distance to get to its destination. Soil blends and compost that are sold up and down the East Coast. So exactly to John's point, it's the availability for that region. And even just locally here, we have a lot of different people that make compost, and the price points are different depending on how they make it, the materials that go into it, their whole process in general. So it's a lot of different things, and people, I think a lot of times, if you have good results, the market value goes up, and people are willing to spend the extra money to make sure that they have a better outcome with their growing.
Anita followed up in the chat if there was a range of pricing for unfinished compost. 15 a ton, is that cheap?
15 a ton is very inexpensive. Unfinished compost makes me a little nervous. So you have to have the ability to either pile that up and let it go through a thermophilic process, or pile it up and let it go through a secondary decomposition process. So generally speaking, at least I don't see people selling unfinished compost intentionally. Sometimes compost producers produce pretty poor compost that's not very finished, but they think it is. But generally speaking, I don't find people selling unfinished compost much.
Yeah, I wonder if there's any, feel free to elaborate on that. I wonder if it's more of a feedstock thing or something else. And I know a lot, at least us, half of, okay. Chicken manure. Understood. I think a lot of it has to do with your shipping too. At least us, when we buy stuff in, and half of the price of what we're getting is the trucking costs, of what's getting delivered.
And Anita,
that's at scale. It depends on how much and all that.
Yeah, and Anita, I would answer your question by just saying whatever the market will bear. So
yeah.
I mean, you're not in this just for the fun, although it is fun. You're in it to make a profit, and if you bump it up and nobody wants your product, then the market isn't going to bear the price. But you should feel free to bump it up till you hit that trigger point.
Well, we're starting to live in a world now where waste is becoming a commodity. Where years ago, people couldn't wait to give you the waste to compost, and now we're in a position where people are selling manure to composters to compost. So I think that helps kind of answer it as well. Is that years ago you would be begging a composter to take it, say, please take my manure, I need to get rid of it, or please take my chicken manure, please take my horse bedding. Now they're like, wait a minute, these compost guys really love this stuff. Maybe if they want it bad enough, we can sell it to them. And that's more than what happens now. Not everybody is lucky enough to produce that themselves. So that's one thing to consider as well, is if you have something that people really like and they want it, like John said, raise the roof on it a little bit.
Some economics right there. And we have one last question. I think that'll be our last one before we close out. But from Marjorie, do you think there is an opportunity to support the community by participating in food scrap drop-off programs? I realize contamination would need to be controlled, but wondering if your experience with that.
We have a lot of experience
Mhm.
with that. And Matt, I'll let you speak, but we're working with more and more municipalities to help them figure out, and there's no one size fits all. There's every different model out there that you can imagine, but we're working with our local municipalities because they know that New York State is lowering the amount that can be landfilled, the amount of food scraps, I should say, that can be landfilled, and we're getting within a couple of years, we'll be getting down to the residential level. So folks know that this is coming. They're not going to be able. In fact, the whole idea of waste is what has gotten us in so much trouble. There is no such thing as waste. And as Matt says, there is competition more and more for what we used to call waste. In fact, there's competition, and it's getting fierce in some parts of the country for food scraps, primarily those who are doing anaerobic decomposition, producing methane to burn to produce electricity.
I think the one thing I've learned over the years is that the word community, when it involves with composting, has such a various definition. For instance, our compost facility is kind of in an interesting location. We're right on the Connecticut border. We're just far enough away from a large population where they have other options to be in that 25-mile radius. We do receive food waste from New York City. We do receive things. And, right across the border from us in Connecticut, there's a facility that has their community composting program kind of piloting right now. And they are, they've asked us for some advice on things. So it's interesting because you get in areas like that where we're doing large scale composting, where some of the material does come from a couple hours away, where there are opportunities that are closer. But for those people, the facility that sits about 3 or 4 miles closer to them is the choice. So, and I guess what my point is for that is that, with our community, it's kind of like we're right here on the Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York border. So, we find ourselves talking to some of them and seeing what their concerns and what their challenges are. And, we've even looked into bridging that gap. A border is just a line on a map. And if we can get everything working together, making sure that, obviously testing and all that goes the way it should in a universally understood way, that's what I think drastically changes that sense of community with composting. And, it's one of those things that, food waste especially is something, it's like a $600 billion waste every year. There's a huge amount of it, and the 15,000 cubic yards that we process every year is such a small part of it. So the source is there, getting people engaged through education. For our community compost drop off, we have marked bins that says clearly what it is. If we get any municipalities or any people who want to drop off at our facility, we have a really well spelled out strict rule list that we give out to make sure people understand that. And I think as long as you keep hitting those points and showing people what you do, and showing the negative impact of the bad things, the very positive impact of the good things, that's how you can create that really healthy dynamic in the community.
Anything to add, Nicole? Or are you good? Sweet. All right. Well, we are just about 2 minutes to the end of this session, and I'm worried that we might all get kicked off of Zoom if we hit exactly that time. So I will now say thank you to everyone who came and participated. Thank you for all your really great questions, and Matt, John, Nicole, and Jen, who couldn't make it at the last moment. Thanks for everyone.